good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending where you're dialing in from. A very warm welcome to this Fieldfisher webinar on foreign direct investment. I'd like to start by thanking you for joining us today for a conversation around FDI regimes in the UK and Europe. My name is Miguel Vaz. I'm a partner in the Competition, FDI and Regulatory team of Fieldfisher in London. And I will be chairing or hosting this afternoon's conversation. Before I present our panel of speakers, let me spare a few thoughts as to why this topic and why now. As some of you may know, over the past couple of years, we've seen a proliferation of foreign direct investment regimes across the European continent. In many cases, this proliferation was a response to an increasingly protectionist drive in the Western world. As these foreign direct investment regimes start to mature, we believe it is important to understand their drivers and the challenges that these drivers pose to companies. And so to help me explore this topic today, I have a rather talented panel of speakers joining me. So from Fieldfisher and from the Fieldfisher London team, I have Associate Asfen Golzar. To cover Spain, we will have a partner in the Madrid office, Borja Martinez Corral. To cover the French perspective, we will have Anne-Laure Desius from our Paris office. And to cover a German perspective, we will have Sascha Dethoff from our Düsseldorf office. I'm also particularly happy to host Amy Newland, Deputy Director in the UK Investment Security Unit, which will provide us an overview of the UK National Security and Investment Act, and tell us a bit how the Investment Security Unit works and the challenges that they faced over the past couple of years. So thank you very much, Amy, for joining us today. And I think it's really helpful that the business can hear from you, your perspective. I think before I progress, obviously, I would make attendees aware that Amy will not be speaking about past or current cases, as you will obviously understand. So what's the agenda for today? We will start with an introduction on FDI regimes in the UK and Europe. This is basically to take you through the basics of foreign direct investment and to set the scene to then take a deeper dive into national regimes. Chapter 2 will be a deep dive. We will start with the UK National Security and Investment Act, and Amy will take us through a number of perspectives from the Investment Security Unit. We will, after that, have the opportunity to ask a few questions. And then we will have my colleagues from Fieldfisher talking about specificities of the French, German, and Spanish regime. And on section 3, we will close with a look into the future of FDI in Europe. And with that, I'm handing over to Asfen to talk about FDI in general and to provide a quick intro in terms of background and context to FDI regimes across Europe. Asfen, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Miguel. If you wouldn't mind clicking next on the slide, I've still got the title page on my screen. So as Miguel's mentioned, before we take a deep dive into the specifics of the FDI regimes in Europe, I'd like to give a little bit of background on the development of FDI regimes. So Europe has always attracted and welcomed foreign investment. It has prided itself on being open for business and is generally seen as an investor-friendly environment. But as foreign investments have increased rapidly over the years, and more of these investments are originating from emerging market economies, we have seen an increasing desire on the part of governments to exercise greater control over flows of foreign investments into their jurisdictions. And as FDI regimes proliferate and mature around Europe, countries are also taking an ever more expansive view of the concept of national interest or national security to include more than just traditional military and defence interests. In many cases now, national interest also extends to critical infrastructure and communications assets, as well as critical supply chains. But what has driven this growth in FDI and national security regimes across Europe, and why are we seeing unprecedented levels of enforcement in this space? Well, there are several technological, economic, and geopolitical drivers for this, including rising protectionism, as Miguel has mentioned, but also concern about the loss of critical assets and technologies, and then more recently, the need to protect critical industries in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic in particular, I think, was key in causing countries to expand on this protectionist trend. Many countries introduced specific measures to secure the protection of key national assets and supply chains, with countries introducing temporary amendments to protect vulnerable companies from opportunistic foreign takeovers. Countries like the UK, for example, implemented measures to protect domestic life sciences companies, and then elsewhere in countries like France and Germany, there was an expansion of the strategic sectors in which transactions require mandatory notification to include certain pandemic-related activities. Here we are with the slides. So the national security and FDI landscape in Europe is continually evolving. And if we take a quick tour of what we're seeing in Europe, what we're seeing is an increasing number of countries that have either already established FDI screening mechanisms, which are shaded in green in the map here, or countries that are in the process of exploring and deploying FDI regimes, which are the countries shaded in yellow. So at the EU level, the European Commission has been encouraging member states to adopt FDI screening mechanisms, and has even named and shamed those that have not done so. So new FDI regimes continue to be implemented in the EU. Just recently, we've seen Luxembourg, Belgium, and Estonia have all adopted FDI regimes this year. And there are 6 other countries in the EU that are considering or in the process of adopting an FDI screening mechanism. Countries outside of the EU, take Switzerland, for example, has also issued an initial draft of an FDI law that is currently, I believe, under revision. So we're not going to be able to go into detail in all of these countries, but as Miguel has mentioned earlier, we will try and contextualize the current trends in a focused set of jurisdictions to hopefully assist with understanding the headwinds and assessing how best to manage FDI related considerations. With that, I'll pass back to you, Miguel.
Thank you very much, Aspen, and sorry for the slideshow mishap. The computer actually froze. The wonders of technology. With that in mind, and with the map of the proliferation of the FDI regimes across Europe, I think it's important to discuss why understanding FDI obligations is critical. And I think there is a market misconception around, FDI only applying to the defense sector. No. It's not just about the defense sector, it's about a wide range of sensitive sectors that are affected by foreign direct investment obligations. Although the defense sector takes a big chunk of the notifications in some countries, so for example, it's the case in the UK that the defense sector is a relevant sector with a lot of notifications, but it's not so much in other European countries. It's not about specific nationalities, although national interest might dictate that some nationalities are under slightly tighter scrutiny, not in the sense that the law applies differently to them, but in the sense that, you know, certainly countries will want to review certain transactions in a bit more detail. Then obviously, investors will need to be proactive because some FDI obligations to notify the regulators are mandatory and are pre-closing. So failure to notify the regulators of a certain transaction involving an FDI angle might generate financial penalties and even potentially an unwinding of the transaction. And finally, I think the last factor to bear in mind is that the FDI landscape is evolving quickly. The sectors under scrutiny also change. So let's think about, for example, artificial intelligence. 3 years ago, it was not so much of a buzzword, and today it's an incredibly important sector and under sort of a closer scrutiny in some cases. In very general terms, and I know my colleagues will speak about their specific jurisdictions, but in very general terms, what triggers a mandatory FDI filing are normally two key factors. One is an acquisition of control of the target. And again, note that acquisition of control varies depending on the jurisdiction. So there's not a cross-jurisdictional definition of acquisition of control. So for example, Germany has quite sort of tight rules around acquisition of control when you acquire minority, very, very minor shareholdings. Other countries are not so strict. But so acquisition of control being one of the factors. The second factor is acquisition of control where in a target company active in a key sector, a sector of national interest for that specific country. And finally, my last slide on this introductory bit is around the interplay with other regulatory review processes. FDI became immediately a very important approval process and regulatory process for every acquisition or sale of an asset in the European space and in the UK, because it will interplay with, for example, merger control. It will interplay as well with the new foreign subsidies regulation. So when you're preparing to sell an asset or to buy an asset, FDI is a risk that you need to consider early on. You need to consider and factor in the approval timings that each regulator in each jurisdiction will take to review your FDI notification. And you need to understand whether, you know, your potential acquirer represents a significant risk of a transaction not being approved on FDI grounds. And so it's yet another consideration you should bear in mind, specifically if you're active in one of the mandatory sectors. But even if you're not, please bear in mind that usually regulators enforcing FDI have normally a discretionary power to call in transactions to the extent they think they are within the national interest kind of definition and scope. And with that, we're going to enter into the deep dive section of our session today. And we're going to start with the United Kingdom, and in particular with the act that enforces FDI in the UK, which is the National Security and Investment Act. And who would be more suited to sort of take us through the UK landscape than Amy, which, as I mentioned at the beginning, is a Deputy Director in the Investment and Security Unit here in the UK, which is the entity that is in charge of reviewing the foreign direct investment notifications, reviewing and approving the foreign direct investment notifications. So with that in mind, Amy, I will give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Miguel. It's great to be here. Thank you very much for inviting us. It is always important to hear your perspectives and also to learn from other regimes. And I should say that was a very kind introduction, but I must caveat, I joined the Investment Security Unit in June, and so cannot take credit for the enormous amount of work that's gone into creating the regime, but am now very much a part of and a privileged part of the unit. So as you'll all be wildly familiar and has been covered in the introduction, the National Security and Investment Act in the UK does give the UK more powers in this sense. It builds on other legislation that we've had for much longer, for instance, the Enterprise Act, and really is, like in other countries, a significant upgrade, but always works on the kind of set of guiding principles that the UK's reputation as an open and attractive place to invest absolutely must be maintained, and we seek to minimise business burdens whilst protecting national security. So our aim very much in sort of running the Act is to provide as much clarity and certainty as possible, clear, defined timelines and processes, recognising that, of course, within that there is always a little bit of an unknown about kind of what we're looking at when we're talking about national security. And I should emphasise from the start that the Secretary of State in the current situation, that is the Deputy Prime Minister, makes his decisions on a quasi-judicial basis, meaning that they must be impartial and cannot take into account political considerations. So looking really briefly at the scope and actually just to touch on a few dates, you'll all be wildly familiar that it commenced, and more so than me, on the 4th of January 2022, and mandatory notifications started from this point. But the Secretary of State's call-in power applies to any relevant acquisitions that took place on or after the 12th of November in 2020. If we move on actually to just sort of look at a bit of a bird's eye view in our in how kind of the regime runs in this summary slide. So first of all, awareness. The Secretary of State becomes aware either because of a mandatory or voluntary notification, or because of market monitoring that we undertake in the ISU. Something will be mandatory if activities are happening in some parts of 17 sensitive areas of the economy. And where those are mandatory notifications, they must receive clearance before completion. Otherwise, the acquisition can be void in law. As Miguel said, you know, across regimes, I'm sure these sorts of stark points are why the regimes are, you know, are really having to factor into all of your decision making and timelines. So the kind of timescales, if a party has notified the ISU, as soon as we have accepted that, which we aim to do speedily, there are 30 working days before during which the ISU is screening that transaction. And at the end of that period, you will have received either a notice that no further action will be taken, or a notice calling the acquisition in for further detailed assessments. And I should say that in some cases, information notices get issued to parties in that time frame, and those will appear with very short deadlines. But it's really trying to get to a conclusion as quickly as possible. And you know, wherever possible, avoid going into a longer period of assessment just for the sake of potentially a couple of missing bits of information. So then, I guess I should preface that if you, amongst the kind of many notifications that that have been received in the UK, as our annual report shows, only about 7% of those in that time frame were subject to a call-in. And we have what's called a Section 3 statement, but anyway, public guidance on how the Secretary of State uses his call-in power. That gives a few examples, and we'll also come on to a couple of examples shortly on kind of what's going on and what's in mind. But if something is called in, ISU will offer a meeting to the parties at their earliest convenience to make sure all are clear on what is happening and what the process is. The ISU will have 30 working days to conduct an assessment. That can be extended by another 45 working days, but only by agreement with the acquirer. Unlike in that first 30-day period, during this, what we call assessment period, the clock will stop on those timelines where information notices are issued. And after a call-in, your situation may broadly be cleared, have remedies imposed to mitigate national security concerns that have been found, or be blocked. But again, from the annual report, it's clear in that period of time only 5 were blocked in the reporting period. So, you know, really relative to the numbers is very unlikely. And that decision can be challenged by filing a claim for judicial review within 28 days of the decision being made. If remedies are imposed, that second of those 3 scenarios, examples include placing requirements on board structures, assurances on security controls, but any intervention through that form needs to meet the tests of being necessary and proportionate to addressing the national security risks that have been identified. Future-proof. So there are aspects of the Act that can be updated as necessary, and a good example of that is keeping those 17 sensitive areas constantly under review, although of course any of those sorts of changes to the Act would be subject to parliamentary scrutiny. I don't want you to walk away with the with the impression that it could just be changed overnight with no warning. And of course, as I've been referring to throughout, there is a lot of guidance. We keep adding to it. There was new market guidance in April, and there are other links in our presentation here. We keep that under constant review, but are always looking for feedback. So this slide is an example of some of those resources. It aims to help guide through the decision of whether an acquisition needs to be notified. We'll always look at your notification, but you can see that from the sort of first line that if the activity isn't in the UK, that is one of those examples where you don't need to tell us, because that will not be in scope of the Act. So yeah, a sort of series of a mini decision tree really to help navigate through that notification question. So I said we'd look at a couple of scenarios. So coming on to a couple of maybe too simple examples. The first case study, we've got UK-owned company A is a recent startup spun out of a leading UK university. The company is developing AI solutions with a potential military application. Following a recent funding round, company B, based in a country hostile to the UK, plans to invest in return for a 30% stake in company A and a seat on the board. So in that case, there is clearly activity going on in the UK. The acquisition takes it over 25% shareholding, which is one of our trigger events, the others being going above 50 and above 75%. This is also, looks like it's in the AI and possibly defence sectors. So very likely this is a scenario that that would be notified to the Secretary of State. And indeed, it is one where the Secretary of State could call it in if he had reasonable suspicion of a threat to national security in it. And in that kind of, as I talked about, that sort of 30-day period at the beginning, we'll be looking at that, at the target risk, at the acquirer risk, and the control risk. And if, having carried out a deeper assessment, national security risks are identified, remedies in this case might include, identified and such that we don't go down the route of clearing this, then at one extreme there could be a block on the investment, or indeed imposing remedies like protection of the intellectual property from the investor, maybe UK nationals only on the board, maybe something about retaining a company HQ in the UK, through to providing kind of informational assurances. I use those as examples of the things that could come into play in a situation like this. The second case study there, UK-owned company C is a second-tier supplier to the MOD, producing components for encrypted radio communications equipment, not something I'm an expert in. A multinational private equity fund has launched a takeover of this company. Media reporting suggests the private equity fund intends to sell off Company C's assets, including its intellectual property, and increase Company C's debt burden. I mean, there we've mentioned media reporting. It may be that this sort of scenario would be picked up by our market monitoring, but equally, the Company C may well choose to notify, which would be sensible given that this is, it does appear that it would likely be in the areas that we're interested in. There is a defence, communications and dual use angle, so quite likely subject to mandatory notification. Again, in this one, if further investigation did find a risk and this was called in by the Secretary of State, the kind of outcomes and indeed remedies that may be considered might be requirements to, again, to retain activity in the UK, regular assurances on the handling of information and how that happens as examples. And as I said, the what's called the Section 3 statement that we published also has some scenarios in it. So just moving on to a little tiny recap of progress so far. So operating nearly a year and a half, and I guess that's out of date because I mean we'll be coming up for 2 years before we know it. So recently, as I said, more extensive guidance on a range of topics, including top tips on how to do a notification. And looking at our transparency. So I talked about how, you know, if you receive a call-in notice, you would be offered at your earliest convenience a meeting with us, and kind of looking at the kind of communication that's happening on an ongoing basis. So finally, the annual report I have mentioned a little bit throughout, but we published the 2022-23 annual report in July, which sets out a range of statistics you can see there, and I've picked out through the course of this discussion, but is very much part of trying to sort of demonstrate how the Act is being used and provides transparency where we can on what is happening. Across that and all things, I very much welcome your feedback, and that is so important to keeping things like our guidance under constant review. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amy, for a very insightful presentation. I think we get now to the moment where we ask you a few questions, and maybe we contribute a bit for the further sort of for the next steps within the ISU and in terms of what the market might be feeling and what we see also on our side as counsels to some of the companies subject to the NS&I Act. I know, Sasha, I know you had a question to start. Do you wanna go first?
Yes, many thanks for that. Many thanks for the presentation. Very interesting. And I have a question regarding the number. You mentioned that you had 866 notifications, which is quite a large number. Also, for example, compared to Germany, where we had about 300. So obviously a lot of work for you and for the lawyers. I was just thinking, does this suggest that the Act is working well, that the businesses are now familiar with the regime? What is your view there?
Thank you, and it's really helpful to understand that same picture in Germany. So I mean the flippant short answer might be, well, yes, that's showing it's working really well. I mean it's clearly not that simple, and I think one of the challenges for all of our regimes is how we know they're working. How do you evaluate the success or otherwise is going to be an ongoing challenge. I think that number is helpful, and what we are seeing in other patterns are things like we are more readily able to accept notifications into our system, which feels like it represents some learning about how the process works. Our guidance may or may not have helped with that. But those things do feel like they are indicators that people are building their understanding. I guess without full information on the total pattern of acquisitions across an economy, it's hard to know exactly whether that's completely successful. But I think, as I say, the need to sort of keep engaging, like this, like understanding how our guidance is landing, will be a really ongoing priority for us.
Thank you, Amy. If I may, and also a question around this number of notifications. Did it allow you to see more or less what works well, what works less well? I mean, what are common mistakes you see parties doing when sort of notifying certain transactions? Is there a trend you can see? Is there some sort of a best practice advice that you could share?
So actually, one of our updates to our market guidance, and I appreciate there are lots of elements to this, is a top tips guide on putting a notification in. So yes, we are trying to use the experience to sort of finesse advice. I cannot pretend to have been here long enough to really understand that, but I'm really impressed with how the teams in the unit do use that information for constant improvement that both helps us and, we hope, parties.
Thanks, Amy. That's really helpful to know. I mean, one quick question I had. One interesting development we've seen this year has been the ISU's move to the Cabinet Office. We know that when the NS&I Act came into force, the ISU originally sat within BIS, but since February this year, responsibility has shifted over to the Cabinet Office, which some would say is a more sort of natural home, a natural fit, given the Cabinet Office's experience in national security and intelligence. So I suppose a question from me would be, has the move to the Cabinet Office led to any change in policy or approach to the assessment of national security issues by the government?
So, I mean, I think that the important thing to remember is that the kind of the point about in the Act the Secretary of State responsible for making decisions is making them in a quasi-judicial way and cannot bring into play political considerations. So that kind of remains very much the case. Some of you will have seen the Deputy Prime Minister commenting at the time of the annual report. He did a interview with Faisal Islam on the BBC as part of it. So, you know, encourage you to sort of reach your own conclusions on where he's standing. For me, it feels like very much that sort of aim of balancing the open for investment with, you know, minimising the burdens on business and making sure this regime is as clear as possible actually remains the case. But as you say, that kind of link to some of the national security community is very much makes sense.
Thank you, Amy. And maybe I should close the Q&A with a final question. We've seen some commentary in the press from some parts of the sort of corporate world, sort of alluding to the fact that whereas there's quite a lot of guidance, and you went through the guidance actually in detail, whereas there's quite a lot of guidance on what constitutes a notifiable transaction, specifically what falls within the mandatory notification provisions. The sort of decision-making process of the ISU, so the actual review of a certain notification, is a bit less clear, less transparent. The House of Commons also issued a memorandum of understanding to sort of say, I mean, I think scrutinizing is a very strong word, but it's to scrutinize the work of the ISU. And I think it also hints at, you know, making it more transparent so that I think in a way it doesn't steer foreign investment away from the UK. Do you think that this is a fair criticism? And are there any steps being taken to sort of make the decision-making process a bit more transparent?
So I guess whilst I completely appreciate that it's very, very hard navigating government websites at times, and that the kind of adding to the pile of guidance doesn't necessarily make it easier to navigate, I think all of those steps and for example, including more detail in the annual report, are all about trying to do that as much as we can. And what we encourage parties to do if they have questions is to reach out to us on our investment.screening, still at bays.gov.uk, just to confuse you, and we'll happily answer queries. It will always be difficult with national security, but I hope you can see from the steps that ISU has been taking that the aim is to be as clear as we can be within those boundaries. And yet, just to emphasise that, we will move email address and we will try to make that as seamless as possible, but it hasn't yet happened. So those of you confused about where we are part of Cabinet Office, but still for the moment on Bays IT.
Thank you once again, Amy. Incredibly helpful, certainly for us as councils, but certainly as well for our clients having to make daily decisions based on FDI and important decisions for their businesses, which have an FDI angle. So thank you so much for your time today, and thank you for joining us. It's definitely really enlightening and helpful for us. With that, we will move into other countries and we will move into the continent, starting with France. And I will bring my colleague Anne-Laure from Paris to run the French regime presentation.
Good afternoon. I'm Anne-Laure Desilous from the French office, and I am the same team has Miguel in the competition, FDI, and regulatory team. So thank you again. And very quickly, yes, I invite you to go through the French regime, which is FDI has started to be regulated for a while, actually for more than 20 years ago. The authority in charge of the FDI control in France is quite peculiar because it's the French Treasury, which is a very powerful body inside the Ministry of Economy. And he intervenes, of course, with the help of the other ministry when they are interested, depending of the case and depending, of course, of the sector, the interested sector of the case. This is how it works in France. And then we can go through the same condition as it is more or less in the other national regimes. So we have specific conditions, of course. The first one is the acquisition of control, which should be at stake. And then, of course, the acquisition should be fully or partial of a branch of activity of a business, or it could be also an acquisition of more than 25% of the voting rights, which applies only to investors outside the EU. And the third condition, let's say, this is, of course, the activities which is concerned, and it's supposed to be sensitive sectors, and the list of sensitive sectors has been expanded years after years, and it's going to be expanded again this year because the French Ministry of Economy has communicated on an extension to extraction and processing of critical raw materials. So yes, very quickly, a very classic two-phase possible review. First phase within 30 working days, and the second phase when we need more time to the French Treasury need more time to investigate the case, and in order to three possible outcomes: authorization without condition, authorization with conditions, or of course the reject of the operation. And as it is in Germany, we have roughly speaking the same number, which is lower than in the UK. It's around 300 case last year, with around 130 authorization. And within these numbers of authorization, we have 70 cases with condition, with engagement taken by the companies to be authorized to by the French Treasury. This is how it works in France. And of course, we don't have so many information on the case which has been reviewed. There is one very famous one because it was released in the newspaper. It was in 2021, and it was the Couche-Tard case. And the French Ministry of Economy has been taken a very public position against the acquisition by this Canadian company of the French food distribution French company Carrefour. This is one of the famous ones. For the other cases, we don't have so many information because it's not very transparent, a very transparent review. But we know who are the sectors focused And that's it, more or less.
Well, thank you very much, Anne-Laure. Very insightful and a good contrasting background to the UK in the sense that the number of cases is actually more aligned with Germany. With that, I'll bring in Sasha to give us an overview of Germany. Sasha, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Miguel. Yes, Germany, well, I have to say, as such, Germany remains an investor-friendly jurisdiction. Of course, yes, FDI becomes an important topic. It is one, and it becomes more and more important. And what we have said here also on our slides is that, the law will again be changed. So there will be other sectors that will be listed in the list of the critical sectors. This has just been published by the government, so in focus for the upcoming amendment of the law is particularly the semiconductor industry, but we will see what else could come up here. When you look at the cases, and I will show you also an overview in a second, you can see that particularly investors from China are in focus. Well, that's fine. Just go to the next slide. Many thanks. Well, if you look at the procedure, I mean, Anne-Laure has just guided us to the procedure in France. It's not that different. Of course, there are some specials here in Germany. If you look at it, you have either the sector-specific review or the cross-sectorial review. It's of course depending on the industry. So sector-specific really means military goods, IT security products, and this applies to all foreign acquisitions. It's then a mandatory notification, and the entry threshold only 10% of the rights. And of course, you have then a prohibition to close the deal. If you are in the cross-sectoral review, and there's really a long list of goods and services that are relevant here, then you are on the right. On the right side of this slide, and this does not apply to all foreign acquisitions, but only to those of acquirers coming from not the EU or the EFTA. So that's the difference here. In all other cases, I have to say, well, the ministry could look at it. There's a threshold of 25%. And this is also important to know that, well, the ministry could look at it. Of course, there is then no obligation to notify it. The further procedure, well, you have, of course, a phase 1, it's 2 months, and then a phase 2, which is longer. I won't guide you through the details here, just for, as always, for the transaction planning, of course, it's important to have at least a view, is there risk of a phase 2 case? Because, well, it takes much longer, of course. All right, let's go to the next slide. So some statistics, because I think it's actually quite interesting to see what are the cases. We already had the number of roughly 300 cases, so not as many as Amy has on her table, but still quite a few. And what you can see is, well, the large majority is cross-sectoral, so only 14% are sector-specific cases. And also, if you look at the duration, as I said, transaction planning, at least 1/3 is really a speedy review up to 30 days, and then another 22% is between 31 and 40 days, and then you see that it gets smaller. Of course, well, as I said, if it's a phase 2 case, it can take several months, and then it can be quite a lengthy review. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Also here some statistics, and I have to say we did not do them ourselves, but it's a very nice service by our ministry. What you see here on the left is, well, where are the acquirers coming from? So most of them are coming from the US, maybe not a surprise, but of course also quite a few from China. It's still in the news, many cases with China. I'll come to that. And also the UK, of course, important here. And Japan is still quite a significant number. The industry is also here, not to guide you through all industry, but it's you can see, well, IT industry, communications is very interesting. Health, biotech is very, very important. Quite a few cases, engineering. And then you see the other sectors here, 7 in the semiconductors industry. I just mentioned it, as I said, that this might be then a different review then soon. Okay, we can go to the next slide. We have listed here several cases to just give you some, well, just some insights. What are important cases? What were the cases that were blocked? And what you can see here, well, you know, we have semiconductor cases. We have acquirers from China. Where we have blockings. We just actually had one very recently that was in the news just roughly 1 week ago with regard to satellite technology. Also there, a Chinese investor that was blocked. But that, of course, and I just want to refer to my first slide, still it is an investor-friendly environment. Over to you, Miguel.
Thank you very much, Sasha. On that very positive note, and in the interest of time, I will move on to Spain, and I will bring to the center Borja to take us through the FDI regime in Spain and the latest changes, which I know also occurred recently with some news from Madrid. Borja, floor is yours. Borja, I can see you sweating, so that might mean that you've kind of ran across 2 floors and are now in a room that
yes.
So the floor is yours to an overview on Spain. You have round about 3 minutes.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, well, as Sasha said, in Germany, Spain is also a friendly jurisdiction, both in the terms of the legislation and the application by the authority. We have recently an update of the procedure. We had these FDI regimes in 2019. The first filings were in 2010 and 20, but the procedure was a procedure which was 20 years old, so it was not exactly what we needed from a company perspective to conduct an efficient review. So we have a brand new procedure, which is hopefully next year it's going to yield brilliant results. I will focus on the main elements of my presentation. I would like to stress that in Spain, we don't have a list of sectors, a closed list of sectors, but rather we must file any transaction that either has a particular investment of a particular set of assets, which is trans sector, and also if the investor have certain qualities. So if we move to the next slide, we can see the notifications, the circumstances that trigger the notification in relation to the investment. You can see that we are talking not about sector per se, but type of assets, critical infrastructures, critical and double use technologies, most importantly, supply of fundamental inputs, and sectors with access to sensitive information. In practice, this would cover telecommunications, healthcare, also life science, and of course energy, which is the most relevant. Also certain mining sectors, lots of different sectors. So almost any sector could fall in any of these categories. The new regime is also very positive in the sense that it clarifies some of the darkest concepts that we have. In this slide, you can see the circumstances where a filing must take place in relation to the nature of the investor, mainly if the investor is a public company or if it poses a threat to Spanish national interests, if it has been sanctioned for public or other reasons in another country, or it has engaged in criminal or legal activities before, the authority would also enter to see this transaction. And in these cases, no exemptions apply. When you have to notify because of the nature of the investment, you have certain exemptions that would not apply if the investor is a foreign government or is a former offender or any other circumstance that may affect Spanish national interest. If we move on to the next slide, I have listed here some procedural interesting points. First of all, you have a voluntary consultation for clarifying whether or not your transaction meets the notification criteria. We also have a reduced timeline of 3 months. We worked under a 6-month deadline before, and now it's has been halved. The final decision is normally taken by the Council of Ministers, but in certain cases, particularly investments below 5 million euro, the decisions would fall within the Trade Ministry. We also have a specific procedure for the defense sector, which is focused on activities related to defense. If you have read about certain Saudi company which is investing in 9.9% of Telefónica in Spain, it doesn't fall within the general regime, but it has been assessed by the government because it affects the defense interests. So this would follow this special procedure. And finally, the consequence of non-compliance, which is, first of all, the transaction will have no legal effect in Spain. And secondly, you can be fined different degrees, but the highest fine will be an amount equal to the amount of the transaction. If we move on to the final slide, when we can have some data, we do not have particular information on specific cases as the decisions are confidential, but we have aggregated data for the latest exercise, which would be closed on the 31st of December 2022. In those 12 months, we had 73 formal decisions. We have a couple of hundreds of consultations and informal approaches to the authority. Out of these 73, 63 were cleared without any condition or encumbrance. 9 were cleared with certain condition or mitigating circumstances as conditions, as the authority calls them. And only one was banned without, because the authority said that there was no mitigating circumstance or measure available. We do not know the sector or the identity of the company, but we do know that the circumstances that, or the measures that the authority is considering to mitigate risks of foreign investments include the 4 that you have on the slide. Guaranteeing the supply of goods or services to the Spanish market, limiting the access to sensitive information. This would apply particularly if the investor is a foreign government. Maintenance of certain capacities, which also includes not only maintaining the actives in operation, but also investing in their maintenance or updating. And finally, obligations to supply certain information to the government to monitor this activity. You can see also the percentages. So the decision that was banned was the first decision ever to be banned. We have been applied this regime for 3 years, and only this year, in 2022, the government decided to block a transaction based on this inavailability of mitigating measures. So that would be in a nutshell for Spain. I can answer any question if you have.
Thank you very much, Borja, for a record time presentation. I think I'll just wrap up with the future of FDI in Europe. And, this is maybe a very personal view of things, but, we've seen some new regimes coming into force over the past couple of years. I think we will see in the next few years the regimes maturing, companies becoming more aware of how the regulators interact with the market. There's also more useful guidance, as Amy sort of alluded to. And I think there's also a push from a number of elements within different jurisdictions to have a bit of a more transparent decision-making process to the extent possible. Obviously, national security and national interests are defined differently in different places. The definition of its own concept will change, and therefore, the regimes will always be in flux. New industries will come into the spotlight, say artificial intelligence, rare earths, and mining rare materials, as we've heard, for example, in Germany. And so I think the market needs to keep an eye on these developments and making sure that they're up to date as to what are the key sort of risks and the key hurdles that they need to clear from a foreign direct investment perspective. And so I think that, again, I mean, this is an update that is very focused on the present day and looking as to what had happened in the past and lessons that we can learn from maybe cases that have been, or notifications that have been blocked. But I think the conclusion is that we need to keep vigilant, and above all, we need to consider FDI factors in the beginning or from the outset of planning an acquisition or a sale of an asset, because they will be a key condition precedent to closing, and they will be a key element to be considered in the choice of a potential buyer, or in the choice of the right market to invest your capital on. And on that note, and I think we've responded to all of the Q&As when Borja was running around the office to find his microphone. So, and in the interest of time, we're 7 minutes over the 5 p.m. I would just like to thank once again Amy very much. Thank you for joining us. Very informative presentation. I think definitely the market needs more interventions from you to bring in that transparency that everyone is asking for. So thank you once again very much. It has been incredibly helpful for all of us and for our clients. And thank you to all participants and to my colleagues across Europe for joining and putting in your piece of the puzzle in today's picture. So thank you very much. And to the extent you have any further questions, and again, in the interest of time, please do feel free to email us, call us. Smoke signs are also a possibility. Do get in touch. Thank you very much and have a great afternoon.
Good afternoon.